gave a version of this talk at the DLF forum this year, but I wanted to share it with the Samvera community as well. I started working directly with communities that support open source for cultural heritage organizations 6 years ago. I'm not a developer, I don't write any software code, and neither do many of the most active participants in the Samvera community. There are so many ways to contribute to open source, both in this community and in other open source communities that you may rely on. So I wanted to share why you might want to contribute and some participation options that you might want to consider. So if you're not familiar, open source at the most basic definition is it's a type of software license that makes software freely available to use, modify, and enhance. And in the cultural heritage ecosystem, open source projects provide, or often provide and can provide, the digital infrastructure that we need to do our work. So it's software built in the open, used and supported and built with support and input from a community of users like our community. So why might you want to contribute to open source, no matter what your current role or your current technical understanding might be? And first of all, I can assure you that open source needs you. Our open infrastructure relies on volunteers, and the tools we collectively produce are only made better by a greater diversity of perspectives and experiences. So many hands make light work, but we also need both new and experienced community volunteers to make sure that our open infrastructure does what it needs to do, and then it gets into the hands of those who can use it. Relying too much on the same few people can lead to burnout, and it can really set a community back. And I want to emphasize that code is important, of course, but code is just one part of making open source work. I think this quote from the open source guide is really spot on, that a common misconception about contributing to open source is that you need to contribute code. And in fact, it's often the other parts of a project that are most neglected or overlooked. So you'll do the project a huge favor by offering to pitch in with these types of contributions. One reason you might want to work within an open source community is to learn and develop your skills. You can take on something that you might not get to do in your regular role, or something you want to learn more about, an area where you might like to get more experience. You can learn more about how technology is made, how it works, how software gets done. And if you don't consider yourself a technologist now, but you want to learn more about those roles, an open source community is a great place for you. It's also a great place to learn facilitation. And of course, open source community includes people and institutions that are much like your own, but could also be a place to meet people who are in completely different roles and different kinds of organizations all around the world. It can mix up who you're working with regularly and help you make lasting connections. So hopefully I've given you something to think about why you might want to get involved, but how exactly would you go about doing it? So I've talked already today about working groups. They are done differently. There's different approaches in different communities. There's interest groups, there's working groups. Some communities call them advisory groups, but this is really where the work of open source community starts. So if you join a working or interest group, I guarantee you will be welcomed with open arms, even if at first you feel like you're just there to listen and learn. You probably won't just be listening and learning for long, because there's always ways that you can help. So for example, in our community, we have the marketing working group, where we're looking at outreach and engagement and promotion of Samvera technologies to folks who could use them, institutions who might want to investigate Samvera technologies that might be useful to them. So one thing that that group created is a very cool tour of Samvera repositories to highlight the institutions that are using the software. And that's the kind of idea that could come from anyone at any level in the institution who might want to learn more about, in this case, story maps, which is what we use to make this tool. There are also often groups that gather feedback and work together. And we had a repository manager interest group for a while in this community, and at sundown, didn't have a lot of attendance. But this is the kind of group that we could always restart or start again if there was someone who wanted to volunteer who was really interested, or if there was a different kind of interest group that could fulfill that need. For example, in the DSpace community, they have DCAT, which is a DSpace community advisory team. So there's always options like that in open source communities, and we have space for that kind of a interest group in Samvera as well. So documentation, of course, is never complete. It's never up to date. It can be spread out. We have a working group that's trying to work on making that better, but it's always a challenge. Documentation can live on a wiki, and it can also live in GitHub. So contributing to the documentation that lives in GitHub, making it better and updating it, that's a great way to learn Markdown and to sort of dip your toe into using GitHub. And you don't need to write any code to do that. And release testing is a way to get involved periodically. You'll see calls for QA testing or quality assurance testing for Samvera. You'll see it in other communities as well. This is the testing that makes sure that the new software release is working as expected, and that nothing is breaking before we make that release. Sometimes the release testing is cloud-based, sometimes it's in a test environment, but it can be a great way to help the community and a great opportunity to work with different people and learn some new skills. And improving usability. There's lots of ways to contribute through working groups, helping with strategic planning of usability and accessibility work that needs to be done in our technologies, talking about what's frustrating, what's working in your institution and what isn't. You can make an issue report for a piece of Samvera software, or you can come to the weekly tech call and talk about what is or isn't working for you. Or if you do a usability or accessibility study on your repository locally, if you share that with the community, it can be really, really helpful. And then just general community building. Whenever someone can write a blog post about how they're using Samvera technology that we can post on the Samvera blog, that's hugely helpful for folks who are looking for examples of how Samvera components can work for them. You can start up an interest group. You can always talk to me about your ideas or about ways you'd like to contribute to the community. I'd be happy to help you. And so would community managers or equivalent in other open source communities you might be a part of. We often have ideas that we can't implement because we need someone else to investigate them or head them up. So that's all from me. Thanks, everybody.